Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, listen, I've recently dug into some incredibly fascinating cognitive science that completely, and I mean completely, flipped how I view learning and studying. If your brain has ever felt like a leaky bucket when you're trying to retain information, you are absolutely going to want to hear this. We're going to break down the actual literal mechanics of effective memory and uncover a structured path to stop spinning our wheels. Let's get into it. Right off the bat, we've all been there. You spend 6 agonizing hours buried in a textbook, highlighting absolutely everything until the page is basically just one giant neon block. You finish up feeling like an absolute beast for working so incredibly hard. But then, you wake up the next morning, sit down at your desk, and realize you cannot remember a single thing you read. It is so deeply frustrating to put in that massive amount of effort and see literally zero return on your investment.
Well, if that specific frustration sounds all too familiar, the cognitive science points to a surprisingly relieving truth. Ready for it? The problem is not you. You aren't lazy. You definitely aren't bad at learning, and it is absolutely not because you aren't smart enough. You were just handed a completely faulty instruction manual for your brain. You see, you were never taught the correct biological system for capturing and actually keeping that information.
So let's run a quick, honest diagnostic on our habits. Are you actually learning, or are you just staying busy to dodge the guilt of doing nothing? Think about it for a second. Do you truly understand a concept, or do you just recognize the font and the layout because you've stared at the page 10 times? Are you studying for long hours because it's actually effective, or just because it makes you feel disciplined long after your brain completely checked out? If I asked you to explain your last study session to a 5-year-old right now, could you do it, or would you start stuttering? When you sit down, do you have a specific target in mind, or do you just opening a book and kinda hoping for a miracle? And finally, do you avoid testing yourself because you're secretly terrified to see what you don't actually know? If answering these makes you feel a little exposed, that's a really great thing. We are identifying the roadblocks. To break these bad habits, we're going to dive into the exact framework outlined in a brilliant guide called How to Study Like a Genius: Smart Study Techniques for Faster Learning and Better Memory by Shadow Books. This source lays out a highly precise, step-by-step system to perfectly align your study habits with actual cognitive science. It even includes this awesome 7-day reset plan, where, for example, day 1 is entirely dedicated to just auditing your physical distractions to get you on track.
Let's start with that first big issue, recognizing versus actually understanding. The source calls this the familiarity trap, and wow, it is a massive pitfall. Your brain basically pulls a fast one on you. When you simply reread your notes over and over, your brain says, "Oh yeah, sure, I know this." But familiarity is a total mirage. The very second you close that book, the knowledge vanishes entirely. Why? Because your brain was just a passive passenger during the whole ride. And that brings up our second point, which is a real mythbuster. Time spent simply does not equal learning done. We have been so socially conditioned to value this grind mentality, the grueling 6-hour marathon session. But the reality? You can sit with an open book for 6 hours and retain significantly less than someone who spent just one focused, intense hour using the right methods. The source explains that our attention span has hard biological limits. The human brain actually learns and retains information in small, manageable chunks. Think of Pomodoro-style 25-minute focus blocks, not in exhausting marathon sessions where your cognitive functions literally shut down halfway through. This builds directly into how we figure out what those manageable chunks should be. The source gives us a fantastic rule of thumb here. If you cannot explain a concept simply, you simply do not know it. Genius-level learners are absolute masters at taking highly complex topics and breaking them down into tiny, simple parts. So if you're studying something like the water cycle, and you can't explain it simply enough for a kindergartner to grasp, your chunk of information is just way too massive. You need to dial it back and break it down to just evaporation first. If you start stuttering, you are overloading your working memory.
Now, what about that bad habit of just opening a book and hoping for a miracle? Why do we so often study without real goals? The source explains that vague studying is essentially a one-way ticket to scrolling on your phone. It leads straight to mental fatigue and distraction. Your brain literally needs a GPS destination to function efficiently. Saying, "I'm going to study math" is just a wish. But saying, "I will master the quadratic equation in the next 20 minutes, now that is a concrete target. Specific focus directs the brain's energy efficiently.
Which brings us to how we handle resistance, and that final diagnostic question about the fear of testing. We so often avoid testing ourselves because, well, it feels hard, it's uncomfortable. But the book beautifully reframes this. Think of it exactly like going to the gym. If you lift a feather, your muscles don't grow, right? That uncomfortable friction you feel when trying to recall an answer, that is the literal feeling of new neural pathways being built in your brain. You have to embrace the sweat.
Struggle is actually a biological indicator that true learning is taking place.
If there is one fundamental psychological shift you take away from this entire explainer, please let it be this. Learning is a skill, not a talent. We've got to absolutely drop this pervasive myth of the effortless genius, the idea that some people are just naturally smart and studying is magically easy for them. No way. The source makes it abundantly clear that while having the potential to learn anything is universal, actualizing that potential requires treating learning as a highly structured, repeatable skill that you intentionally practice.
And here's the core difference between amateurs and geniuses when it comes to practicing that skill. Most people study emotionally. They study when they suddenly feel a burst of motivation, or much more commonly, when they are in an absolute panic the night before a deadline. But geniuses, they rely on structure, not fleeting moods. They do not rely on sheer willpower to ignore their phone. They use a system. They physically put their phone in a completely different room, or they use a website blocker. They intentionally engineer their environment so that learning actually becomes the path of least resistance.
Okay, so what do those structured systems actually look like in practice? The book highlights two ultimate mechanics: active recall and spaced review. Guys, this is where the magic happens. Active recall means stepping away from the highlighter, closing the book, and writing down everything you remember on a completely blank sheet of paper. You are actively forcing your brain to retrieve the information, doing the heavy lifting to strengthen that neural pathway. And then there's spaced review. Instead of cramming all at once, you test yourself on that exact same concept 1 day later, then 3 days later, then a week later. The source emphasizes that this specific rhythm literally interrupts your brain's natural forgetting curve. By combining these two mechanics, you completely align your habits with your biology. This is the precise shift that takes you from being someone who merely tries hard to someone who confidently, truly knows the material.
I want to leave you with this final thought. If you keep using the exact same passive methods you used today, will you actually be where you want to be in a year? Be totally honest with yourself. Because now you know the difference between passive familiarity and active learning. The problem wasn't you, it was the system. But now you've got the right framework to stop just trying hard and start actually learning. The real question is, the very next time you sit down at your desk, what system are you going to use? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to start testing these methods out immediately. Catch you next time.